2023 Kofopoulos Economics Nobel Laureate Lecture Series. This event is made possible by a generous gift from our late colleague Milton Kofopoulos in memory of his wife Virginia Kofopoulos. Before introducing our distinguished speaker, I would like to thank our wonderful staff who have worked hard to make arrangements for this event, particularly Elizabeth Eichinger, the director of our programs, who has made all the logistical arrangements for the talk. Elizabeth is standing there. We are also very thankful to our colleagues from Emory IT, who have been very supportive. I would now like to say a few words about Professor Kofopoulos. Professor Kofopoulos was a distinguished economist who contributed significantly to the field of welfare economics and economics of regulation. He joined Emory University as a Woodruff Professor of Economics in 1979 after a decade in Washington, D.C., where he served under President Carter's Executive Council for Economics, President Ford's Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, and the Council on Wage and Price Stability. Professor Kofopoulos retired in 1998, but continued to teach on a voluntary basis in the department for many years. He passed away in fall of 2014 and did not see the inauguration of the lecture series he funded. But his wish for bringing to Emory speakers whose work has been far-reaching and impactful for humanity has certainly come true, with prior guests like Nobel laureate Jim Heckman, Amartya Sen, Thomas Sargent, and Christopher Sims. Our 2023 Kofopoulos Economics Nobel laureate speaker is Dr. David Carr, class of 1950 Professor of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Carr was born in Ontario, went to Queen's University for his undergraduate and to Princeton for his graduate studies. He received his PhD in 1983 after completing his doctoral dissertation titled Indexation in Long-Term Labor Contracts under the supervision of the legendary Orley Ashenfeld. He joined the University of Chicago as an assistant professor, but after a couple of years returned to Princeton, where he was promoted to the rank of full professor within 2 years. He stayed at Princeton until 1997, when he moved to Berkeley, his current home institution. Professor Carr has held visiting faculty appointment at Columbia and Harvard universities and has served as Director of Labor Studies Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Center for Labor Economics at Berkeley. He employed novel approaches to conduct empirical research on a wide range of topics, including immigration, unemployment, gender and race differences, and inequality. He has authored or edited 9 books, 9 journal issues, and published more than 130 peer-reviewed journal articles, which include 45 papers in top 5 journals in economics. Professor Carr has received numerous awards and recognition for his scholarship. Among these are the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics, Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Econometric Society Fellow, American Academy of Political and Social Sciences Galbraith Fellow, John Bates Clark Medal of the American Economic Association, Douglas Purvis Memorial Prize, the IZA Prize in Labor Economics, and the BBVA Frontier of Knowledge Award. Professor Carr has served as the editor of prestigious journals like Econometrica and American Economic Review, and as the president of the American Economic Association and Society of Labor Economics. He has also served on review panels and advisory boards for National Academy of Sciences, Committee on National Statistics, the Statistics Canada, National Institute of Heart, and Russell Sage Foundation, among others. Now it's my privilege to invite Professor David Carr to deliver the 2023 Kofopoulos Economics Nobel Laureate speech titled Labor Markets, Immigration, and Minimum Wage, Economic Research versus Policy. Professor Carr.
Here we go. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming on a nice spring day here after a rocky start this morning. My pleasure to give this award, and I've had a very nice meetings earlier today with grad students and the undergrads, very impressive group of people, as well as faculty. I'm going to be talking about economic thinking on these two topics, minimum wages and immigration, two topics that I've spent quite a bit of my career working on. And hopefully I can give a little bit of flavor of what's gone on in that area, how economic thinking has evolved. I'm going to have a problem not seeing my slides. Is there any way I can talk a little bit? Oh, thanks. Okay, so no one was thinking about that, I guess. I guess if you're a really good talker, you don't need to see your own slides, but obviously that's. Okay, so how are we doing? Is that better? Okay, thank you. And I am going to, there, how's that? I'm going to try and talk right from here, as if I'm standing at the bar. The only thing that's separating, all you people from a good drink is my talk. So here we go. So Keynes said famously that practical people are often the slaves of defunct economists, and economic ideas seem, in my career, I think, have become more important to public policy. Certainly, one thing that's happened, originally in the 1950s, I believe, the President instituted his Council of Economic Advisors. But starting in the 1980s and on in the last few decades, many of the big agencies like the Department of Labor, the Department of Commerce, and so on have had a chief economist. And now there's a chief methodologist at the Census Bureau who's an economist. And so I think our influence has been probably spreading. At the same time, I think we should acknowledge as economists and as people who are listening to what economists say, that economic knowledge is very imperfect, and that policy choices often depend on a lot more than just some of the parameters or some of the insights that an economic model can provide. And so today I'm going to talk about these two topics, immigration and minimum wages, and we'll see, I think, some of the ways how that's kind of worked out. So traditionally, although this is probably hard to believe, traditionally economists used to like immigration, subject to a fairly minor caveat, and used to very strongly dislike minimum wages. So certainly the textbook that I was taught in by a fairly famous British economist who moved to Canada and was certainly a very liberal-minded person, was pretty strongly skeptical of minimum wages, but was fairly positive about immigration. So if we think about what's been going on in economics over the last 40 years, I think what we could say is that, importantly, the views that economists had about those topics were largely based not necessarily on empirical evidence, but on a set of models, relatively simple, actually surprisingly simple models, that economists still largely use when they're thinking about evaluating policies or thinking about what to say if a reporter asks them, what do you think about X or Y? Their normal first reaction of almost any economist is to think about these very simple kind of models. And so what's happened in the last 40 years is that economics has become a much more empirical subject, and particularly leading that field, I would say, or movement, is the field of labor economics, which is the field that I work in, and that has probably developed some of the innovations in this area, probably from an almost accidental basis. Originally, labor economists were largely concerned with wages and things like trade unions. They had those same models that economists use for other topics, but they had, for a variety of reasons, a little bit more of an empirical tradition. And in the 1960s and 70s, data started to become available. Computers, big mainframe computers became available, and people started to investigate that. And that has gradually led to kind of a change in our field. And so that has led, as the evidence has come in, led to, in some cases, somewhat different evidence than people were expecting to see in some of these issues. And so what that has led to some reconsideration or reevaluation of the economic models, not necessarily in a revolutionary sense, but more in an evolutionary sense. And I'll try and talk a little bit about that when I get through the examples. It's early in the afternoon. I prepare this talk and sometimes have to give this talk a little later in the afternoon when people are getting a little sleepy. So I always make sure that we have headlines so that if you now fall asleep, you can remember what the main takeaway was. And so the takeaways from this talk are really twofold. The one is, on the immigration side, the very simple, what I call Malthusian model is wrong. And that's the model that says that more workers means everybody's worse off. So that was the idea that Malthus originally proposed in a late 1700s essay. And on the minimum wage, I'm going to argue that the evidence is pushing our field, labor economics, and eventually the rest of the economics, towards the view that employers have some market power in setting wages rather than taking wages as given. And so that has to be taken into consideration in thinking about a variety of issues, including the minimum wage. So let me start with immigration. This is kind of our this is what my old friend Alan Kruger used to call side-by-side. So we got on the immigration on the left, let's put minimum wages in gray for the moment. The pluses of immigration from the traditional point of view, the first was that immigration expands the economy. And of course, we all know that if the economy gets bigger, politicians feel better. We've got the #1 GNP in the world and so on. So there's a certain kind of pride of place of that. It increases the value of land and capital because now, for instance, if you're a farmer in California and you need to get strawberries harvested, the availability of more labor is going to make it possible for you to do that harvesting more efficiently. And you're going to be able to then bid for more land so that you can run a bigger strawberry farm. So that's a very kind of traditional idea. Same thing with other types of capital. There's a complicated, but for somebody who's taken a few classes in economics, somewhat well-known result, that if you increase immigration, you will, on average, increase the average wages of the natives, unless the immigrants are exactly the same as the natives. So on average, there's a diversification benefit of immigration. And this was well known in the 1960s. I was, in fact, I believe that was on a midterm exam I had in my first course in international trade theory. Now, the main caveat to all of that, was a concern about the possibility that immigration could have a negative effect on directly competing natives. And again, that was something that was understood to be a potential concern, but we hasn't really known how to evaluate that very closely. So the downside of immigration, I think most people, this is Malthus's essay, it's called An Essay on the Principle of Populations and Human Happiness is in the title, so that you know, just so you know that topic has been in economics for a long time. So Malthus basically said the way population works is if people can more than feed themselves, they're going to have more babies. Their babies will survive, population will grow, and that will keep going until they crowd the lands and reduce the fertility of the margin that they have to go to, and then end up with the wage and standard of living pressed back just to subsistence. So it's a very grim view of human population, kind of equivalent to a Darwinian view about population of other species. Malthus was thinking, and in particular in his book, he mentions the effect of the Great Death. So one of the sort of ironies of the Great Death in the 13th century was that although there was a big reduction in population in England and France and most of Europe, actual standard of living afterwards was higher. And Malthus sort of thought about that in terms of his model of the economy and said that made sense. But he was thinking about a medieval economy where people work in agriculture. If we think about today, we all know that larger cities have higher wages, that larger countries seem to have, if anything, higher wages in most cases. That, think of another example of a supply shock, as women have entered the labor force, going from a relatively small fraction, less than a quarter of the labor force when I was born, to very close to half now. That doesn't seem to have pushed down wages very much, if anything, if at all. So, and in fact, there's quite a few countries in the world that are even encouraging immigration. So the three most obvious ones are Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, all three of which have historically relied on fairly large inflows of immigration to gradually expand their economies. So Malthus was thinking about this agricultural world where if there was more people, all we could do was try and work on less and less productive land. But in a modern economy, we can actually do something different. We can actually increase the stock of capital, increase infrastructure, and we can have people working without necessarily hitting a constraint in the amount of land that they have to work with. And so the idea of what's called growth theory got started in the late 1800s as economists realized that this Malthusian trap wouldn't have to occur if we could somehow, when we had more people, also get more capital. And so the standard approach in economics now is that if investment can keep pace with population, then we can have growing population and growing prosperity. Okay, we can actually have everybody at least as well off as they were before. And in fact, one of the people who won the Nobel Prize about 10 years ago, Paul Romer, proposed a theory where because denser population have more interactions and more chances for these kind of diversity interactions I talked about a few minutes ago, there is a good argument that if you have a larger population, you could even increase productivity. So that idea, coupled with the capital accumulation, suggests that maybe we shouldn't necessarily be too worried about changes in the overall supply of labor, and in fact, maybe we should even welcome it. And that, I think, would be consistent with the view in a country like Canada, where there's a very large land area, relatively sparse population, and only a couple of larger cities. So there's been a concern in Canada and other countries that basically the economy would be better if you could have larger groups of people available for pools of specialized labor in more cities. Now, nevertheless, this concern about the downside of immigration can reemerge if you have a case where instead of just counting individual people, you have to differentiate between different skill groups. So if you think that the economy consists of just one type of worker with different levels of the same inherent skill characteristics, so I'm a relatively unproductive worker, so I get 0.9, someone else would be more productive, they get 1.1, somebody's super productive, they get 1.3 of some kind of standard units of human capital. That is actually the standard model that's used in most macroeconomics, and also in the field of urban economics widely used. So this sort of go-to basic models like that. If you believe, however, that the labor market's a little more complex than that, that we need, say, highly educated, middle educated, and less educated workers, and we put those three together in some kind of a function to create our outputs, then you could have a concern if immigration is leading to an imbalance or a change in the balance of those groups. So the research agenda in the immigration field, one of the leading sets of questions in that area has been, how do we measure the diversity of immigrants? So how do we decide how many skill groups there are in the economy? Is there really just one, or is there multiple skill groups? And the answer that's sort of emerged, although I have to say the evidence on this is a little bit less solid than most people would like. The evidence that has sort of emerged is that probably at a minimum, and possibly sufficiently, we need two skill groups. Something like the college-educated workforce, and something like the high school-educated workforce. And you can more or less divide the entire labor market into those two groups. The relative size of those two groups does vary. It varies widely across states and cities in the US. It's varied over time. The college share went up pretty substantially. in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. After the Vietnam War, it went down a little bit, and then it's gradually started to ease up a little bit again. So that seems to be the new, or the accepted model. What about the evidence on that? So how has immigration in the United States changed the relative fraction of people with a college degree versus the relative fraction of a high school degree? Now, probably the most surprising empirical fact I'm going to tell you is it hasn't. That on average, the native population in the United States is about 1/3 college educated, which, by the way, is not very good by world standards. That was really good in 1965 when we first achieved it, 1970, but it's not very good anymore. Nowadays, a lot of other countries have a higher college share. But that's about where we are. The immigrants that come into the United States are a mixture. Everybody, I think, is very familiar with two types of immigrants. So people that work in the medical field, this is very salient. If you're in a hospital, you'll see immigrant doctors and immigrant janitors. And that's more or less a caricature of immigration flows to the United States. Roughly speaking, we've got about 1/3 of our immigrants are at the higher end, and about 2/3 are in the middle and lower end. Just to show that, this is a chart showing the percent of, these are different education buckets. So less than 8 means you didn't actually go to high school. 20 plus means you got a PhD. Now we don't count the fact that it actually takes more than 4 years after undergrad to get a PhD. And on the right, I've got the percent immigrant in each of those buckets, and then the share of the workforce that they represent. Okay, so if we look at the very top bucket, less than 8 years, that's half immigrants. So a very large fraction of the people you see in the labor force who don't have a high school degree are immigrants, about half. But that's only 2% of the workforce. Okay? If you go up a little bit, you get to, say, high school graduates with exactly 12 years. That's 11% immigrants, so a little bit below. The average of all groups is 14. So it's a little bit below average, but that's 34%. Okay? As we go down, you can see we start to get higher levels when we get to PhD, 22% immigrants, again, higher than average, but again, that's only 3%. So you can see this sort of distribution. There's more immigrants at the top and the bottom, a few less in the middle. It turns out that in the STEM areas, immigration is even more important, probably not a surprise to most people in the room. So here's some data by education, the field of education. So the first column is for all STEM, second is computer science, third engineering, and the fourth is economics, just for fun. We consider ourselves a STEM. Of course, lots of other people don't, but we do. And I've showed the fraction of people with different education levels in each of those columns that are immigrants. And you can see amongst all STEM workers in the US, with a bachelor's degree, 21% are immigrants. So remember, 14% is the national average of immigrants in the US, so 21% of the bachelors in STEM are. 34% of the masters and 31% of PhDs. So in the science area, more than like double the fraction of people who are immigrants there than you would expect on average. When we get to computer science and engineering, it's even more extreme, as probably anybody who's walked into the computer science or engineering departments will tell you. So these days in the US, about half of the people with PhDs in those two fields are foreign-born. So the foreign-born are contributing at the high end. They're also contributing very substantially at the very low end. So if you think about who's working in agriculture, that's almost all immigrants in most states, like Texas and California and Florida, the big agricultural states. Okay, so how do we measure the effects of this non-diverse immigrant flow? So it looks like immigrants are coming in, an overrepresentation are at the bottom, an overrepresentation are at the top, an underrepresentation in the middle. What that means is, according to sort of standard economic reasoning, that maybe immigration is pushing down wages for very highly educated people, very low educated people, and raising wages for people in the middle. So finally, we've got an economic policy for people in the middle. What has been going on? Well, we've been trying to work on getting credible evidence on the effects of these imbalances. And credible evidence, of course, is in the eye of the beholder. There's been a long tradition in economics of looking at correlations of data. For instance, looking at the wages in different cities. If you do that kind of analysis, you would find very clearly that high immigrant cities tend to have higher wages. So San Francisco, Los Angeles have high wages. A city like Memphis, a city like St. Louis has low immigration and relatively low wages on the national scale. But we don't think that's very reliable evidence of causality because of the problem that people are choosing where to live, and particular immigrants are choosing where to live, not by accident, but by very determined reasoning. So the idea that I had many, many years ago was to try and break that conundrum by looking at a big shock. And I got this idea from an undergraduate at Princeton who was from Miami. And at Princeton, everybody had to write a senior thesis to graduate. And he was one of my senior thesis advisors. He went on to a very good career in finance in Chicago. His name was Constantine Dracus. And Constantine said he wanted to write a senior thesis on the Mariel boat lift. And I didn't know much about it, having come from Canada and lived in New Jersey up until the time I met him. But as a result of his digging around, I decided, well, maybe I could write a small paper about this, just kind of try and do an analysis. And I think the only real contribution I had was to understand that if we were going to make a statement about what happened in Miami, we needed to have a counterfactual. We needed to have a way to say what would have happened in Miami in the absence of the boat lift. And I had this very boneheaded idea. Actually, it's kind of embarrassing how simple it is. I said, well, let's try and find a set of other cities which in the past have tended to move like Miami. And then let's just compare Miami to that set of cities. And it turned out the set of cities that I put together that mimicked Miami was just a set of 4 cities: Tampa, Houston, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. Kind of an odd combination of cities. But they did have one thing that was kind of similar to Miami, which was a fairly high fraction of Hispanic workers. And they had another thing which was kind of a similar share of manufacturing and similar trend in employment over the last 20 years before that. And so what I did was that I did a very simple, what's now called event study. And this is a picture of what that would look like. So it shows data from 1973 to 1991. Now, I have to say, in my paper, I don't have anything this good. This is better because this was updated by a couple of economists a few years ago. Giovanni Perry, one of my former students, really bore down and said, let's try and make as good a possible synthetic Miami as we can. But his synthetic Miami and mine turned out to be the same. That's our set of controls, or very similar. And you can see what happens. So this is the average wages for lower educated workers in Miami and in synthetic Miami. The boat lift occurs in 1980. If anybody doesn't know the story about this, it was a political event leading Fidel Castro to kind of throw up his hands and say, okay, if anybody wants to leave Havana, they were all holed up in the Peruvian embassy. There was something like 10,000 of them. He said, if anybody wants to leave Havana, they can do that. They just go down to the port of Mariel and they can come and pick them up from Miami. And so what happened is, kind of unbeknownst to him, the Cubans that were already in Miami got organized and organized a flotilla of boats and brought over 150,000 people in the course of a couple of months. And more than 2/3 of them settled in Miami, so it resulted in about 100,000 people being dropped into Miami almost overnight. But you can see, if you look at this graph, that it's really hard to detect a departure from wage patterns in Miami relative to these other cities. Now, it is important to have that comparison, because if you just had the blue line and you didn't have the red line, you could easily convince yourself that things that were going badly, especially if you said, let's look at 1980 versus 1973 or 1974. So the kind of lesson of this paper, and this is a very simple paper sent to a very minor journal, and is that an analysis using control groups could be useful. Subsequent to my work, a lot of people have done very similar kinds of studies. So a couple of people did studies of the end of colonial wars, one involving France and one involving Portugal, which led, after those were wars in Africa, led to the white populations of the colonies and country moving back home. And in both cases, it looked like the Miami situation. A really good example of the same kind of thing was the movement of people of German heritage who got to move back to Germany from Russia after the fall of the USSR in the early 1990s. And related to that, a mass exodus, one of the largest proportional labor market shocks that we've seen to Israel, a movement of Russian Jews to Israel. And interestingly, all of these are somewhat different, but they all sort of show the same thing, which is the labor markets of the target cities or countries have really been able to absorb very large inflows of immigration with very little evidence of big negative effects that you might have thought if you were a Malthusian. A second kind of evidence, so you might think, well, that's good, but that's kind of a case study. I want to see something a little more systematic. A second kind of evidence that people have put together is to study what happens when something goes wrong in a country. And so one thing that happens if something goes wrong in a country is people try and leave. Some of them are going to try and move to the United States. Certainly back in the day, in the 80s, and 70s, and 80s, and 90s, when we had bigger inflows of immigration. And to the extent that they come to the United States, where they end up going is not random. They're going to end up going where previous people from the same country have gone before. And so if you're from Chicago, you'll know that if something goes wrong in Poland, there's going to be a lot of Poles coming to Chicago. Or if you're from Detroit, you'll know that if something has gone pretty badly wrong in Lebanon for many years, but there's a big Lebanese population in Detroit. And that has always been one of the first places that people from the Middle East go to the United States, even though the labor market there is kind of crappy, and you wouldn't sort of think of it as your top #1 tourist destination, especially if you're from Atlanta. Filipino immigrants, because of a quirk in U.S. law, Filipino immigrants had a kind of a break in the immigration policy, and they could go to any city where there was a naval base, and they could work at a naval base. So there's large Filipino enclaves in kind of a peculiar set of places, including Honolulu, Vallejo, California, and in Virginia, where the big naval bases were. And so those kind of enclave patterns mean that you can predict where people are going to end up when something goes wrong in their home country. And using that pattern, I did a couple of studies which try to predict or use this pattern of enclaves to say where are there big increases and increases in the supplies of different kinds of workers. Now, interestingly, this pattern works a little differently than the Mariel. If you know anything about, everyone knows about Scarface. So he's our #1 favorite Marielito. But the Mariel Bolliff was a little bit peculiar in that most of the people who came were very poorly educated. It wasn't the elite of Cuba by any stretch. But some of the episodes that have happened have given rise, for instance, when there's a big migration from Poland to the United States, typically those people that are coming from Poland are among the best educated. So it has led to differences in the flows that go to different countries, and that pattern has made it possible to study. I'm going to skip over that graph. It's made it possible to study that. And the evidence, my reading of the evidence says that actually it's very supportive of the results from these other big shock studies. That in fact, immigrant inflows don't change the outcomes for natives very much. And then finally, there is a third approach, and this is really the traditional economics approach. And the leading proponent of this approach is a labor economist at Harvard named George Borjas. So basically, George said, well, I want to try and do this totally old-fashioned way. I'll basically build a really simple model of the economy, and I'll simulate what would happen if you had an inflow of immigration to different people in the labor market. And in that model, there's really only 3 free numbers. They're what economists call elasticities of substitution. They represent the degree to which different types of workers are competing or complementing other workers. And one of them involves different education groups, one of them involves different age groups, and one of them involves natives and immigrants with exactly the same education and exactly the same age. So those three ways of thinking about it can kind of set up a very simple model. And if you do George's approach, and you look at all the immigration between 1990 and 2010, now that includes a massive increase in immigration in the 1990s during the late years of the Clinton administration. If anyone remembers, we were getting around 1 million people a year coming to the US. So this is a massive increase in immigration. And even in George's simulations, that had a very modest effect. It lowered the average wages of natives with no high school degree by 2%. Now, it's interesting to have this simulation because as someone who does empirical studies, I know that if I tried to put the data together and find an effect that's only 2%, I can't find that. That's too small to find given the precision of the data that's available. So that's kind of consistent with all of these other studies, in my view. And he also found that it does increase wages a little bit, consistent with this diversity premium that I mentioned before. Okay, so if we look back in this scorecard that I mentioned at the beginning, we can see that the main thing that's gone on in this immigration literature in the last years is that we've kind of concluded that there's a relatively small effect of this competing natives problem. So what happened? Well, despite that, immigration basically law has, if anything, become tighter rather than looser. So if you look at immigration policy in the United States, it's probably become pretty systematically over the period since 2010, fewer and fewer immigrants coming in, more and more policies to try and get illegal immigrants out of the United States. That started under President Obama, continued under President Trump, and even under President Biden, it's been a pretty similar set of policies. Similarly, in lots of other countries, immigration has become a very strong political argument and one of the leading causes of the sort of right-wing parties that are becoming more and more influential in many countries. So what's wrong? What's going wrong with our economic thinking? We've got all these results saying this concern about immigration isn't so bad. We think immigration is good for other reasons. Why does no one pay attention? Well, I think the reason is, and in 2012, I did a paper with Christian Discipline and Preston, where we did surveys of people. This was surveys of European countries, different European countries. We asked them sets of questions about their views about immigration, and another set of questions that I'm going to explain in just another slide here, with the idea being that people probably care not just about the labor market effects of immigration, but about another aspect of immigration that's sometimes a little embarrassing to talk about, which is, if you think about when you buy a house, or you move to a neighborhood, or you send your kids to school, what you're really thinking about is who are the other people there? And a lot of people are quite concerned about the fact that immigrants don't exactly look like them. So the people that are coming into the country, especially in the last 20, 30 years, tend to have different race, ethnicity, religion, and language than the existing natives, and maybe than the idealized ancestors of our existing natives. Now, in reality, some of our existing natives had pretty, different immigrant parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, and those great-grandparents were probably viewed somewhat skeptically by the natives at that time, but let's not get into that. Okay, so what we did was we decided to ask a series of questions about two sets of aspects about immigration. So on the left is a bunch of questions we asked about the economics of immigration, and on the right was the questions we asked about this other set of concerns, which we call compositional concerns. And they all kind of, I think, seem pretty intuitive. You think immigrants lower wages, harm the poor, fill job shortages, take jobs away from natives, take out more in social benefits, and they contribute to taxes. So those are very standard kind of things that economists would think about. On the right, this is the more squishy stuff. This is the stuff that political scientists and sociologists normally specialize in. But do you think it's better if everyone shares the same customs, the same religion, the same language,
Do you think that immigrants enrich the culture, and should countries stop immigration to reduce social tensions? So what we did was we took an average of the questions on the left and an average of the questions on the right, and we tried to predict, given those two averages for each of our respondents, what were your views about immigration? Do you think we should let in more people or restrict immigration? And what we found was the answer is 80% questions to the right, only 20% questions to the left. So most people are interpreting and answering questions about immigration and thinking about immigrant issues mainly from the point of view of questions on the right, not so much from the questions that economists have focused on. So, where does that leave us? Well, I think there's a bunch of open questions that new researchers in immigration are working on. Questions about the other benefits of population growth. A really interesting set of questions have to do with what's going to happen to countries that have declining populations. Already, Japan and Korea are facing that in the next few years. Other countries are going to do that. Europe, Germany has got a declining population. Italy, Spain are not far behind. Some European countries are not suffering from declining population as much. France and Britain are doing better in that regard. So that's going to be a big area of adoption. Related to that, and of course, if you're thinking about what are immigrants doing, for your own family, lots of people think, well, how am I going to get somebody to look after my grandmother? Or how am I going to get somebody to take care of my kids? So there's a complementary aspect, especially of low-skilled immigration, which is a subject of much attention these days. Another set of questions that you could ask is, why are these compositional concerns so important? And is there anything we can do about that? Can we assuage people? Can we somehow get views to moderate? Why do they seem to be so important right now compared to where they were 15 years ago? And finally, I think we're going to start seeing in many countries, potentially even the US, more and more discussion about immigration policies which bring in the labor but don't bring in the citizens. Okay, so we have like a temporary migration policy. Now, I should say that there were a lot of temporary migration policies. For instance, people may know about the famous temporary migration policy in Germany. It's called the guest worker program, which led to a big increase in Turkish immigration who never went home. So the usual finding with this is that it doesn't necessarily work, but I think that's going to be something that people talk about. Okay, so let's go on to minimum wages. So minimum wages, I said before, were kind of negative from the point of view of economists, and here's some of the negatives. Reduce employment of low-wage workers, reduce investment, raise consumer prices. The only plus, sort of the opposite of immigration where there's a lot of pluses and one minus, for the minimum wage there's a lot of minuses and only one possible plus, is that maybe raising the minimum wage can raise the income of low-wage workers. But I should say that in the 1950s and 60s, researchers believed that wasn't true. It was very widely asserted that if you raised minimum wages, what would happen is all those people who used to get the lower wage would lose their job completely. So in fact, what you would do is you would really harm the low-wage population. So that was kind of the prevailing view. So where does this economic thinking come about? It's exactly like the immigration thinking. It's derived from very simple theoretical models of demand and supply, where each worker has the same wage at any given job. So the way to think about it is I'm starting a company, I need to get some workers, I look out there and I say, okay, I can get this worker, this worker, this worker, I'm going to have to pay them this much, this much, and this much. I have no control over that. Now, that same framework was widely used to describe product markets, and of course we don't really think that's how product markets work. We know that if we go to one gas station versus another, we pay a different price. If we go to one supermarket one week and another supermarket another week, we're going to pay a different price. So people in the last 30 years have gradually evolved their view about the product market side, and now the standard economic thinking about product prices is that firms have some market power. And I can say, having worked in the retail side of the tech sector for the last couple of years on a part-time basis, that this is an object of great interest and concern. And even online markets, there's a lot of evidence of market power. And so prices are not exactly the same for the same product. If you look down that website when you do a search for something, you'll see, oh my God, I could pay twice as much if I wanted to for the same thing. Okay, so in 1933, a British economist named Joan Robinson showed that actually those same ideas could apply to the labor market. And if firms had some discretion in setting wages, what would you see? Well, you would see kind of an interesting phenomenon. You would see a lot of firms that have workers that say they need more workers and have vacancies. And you'd say, well, why, if you have a vacancy, and you say you need more workers, why don't you raise the wage? Okay? And the answer is, well, that I could do that, but if I did that, I'd have to pay all my existing workers more. And so I have to kind of trade off, pay my existing workers more and attract more workers, or make a little bit of money on my existing workforce and keep that vacancy open and hope that somebody trips into the store and, and hires it. And to tell you the truth, in the 1990s, when Alan Kruger and I started our work on fast food restaurants, we were in Princeton, New Jersey, and it was a situation kind of like today, that the labor market was pretty good, and every single fast food restaurant in Princeton, which of course is only about 4, but all 4 restaurants were advertising for workers. So we thought that this theory had some chance. So how do we get evidence on minimum wages? Well, we use the same basic idea as the Mariel Bolded idea. We realized that there was going to be an increase in the minimum wage in New Jersey. There was not going to be an increase in the minimum wage in Pennsylvania. There was going to be a state-specific minimum wage increase. And so we convinced a couple of undergrads to work for us and collected a whole bunch of data on what was going on in fast food restaurants. And we got started on this project, and it had the unbelievable fortune that one of our undergraduates, his grandmother, was a professional surveyor in Salt Lake City. Her name was Susan Belden. And Susan was the most amazing interviewer of all time. She managed to get fast food restaurant managers to answer surveys at 10 a.m. And she got something like an 80% response rate. Ellen and I had tried to do some of our own survey. We couldn't even get anybody to answer the phone. Somehow Susan managed to do that. And so we managed to put together, I think, what we thought at the time was a fairly, decent survey. It turned out there was some problems with it. It wasn't perfect, and it was a bit noisy and so on. But we showed that in that case, when the minimum wage went up in New Jersey, there wasn't a big reduction in employment. In fact, if anything, there might have been even a little increase in employment in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania. It turned out that idea of looking at a shock had been used before to study what happened when minimum wage was first introduced in the United States, looking at southern textile mills. The people who did that work, however, didn't have the advantage of a minimum wage that only applied in one state and not another. They had a federal minimum wage coming in, so they didn't really have a control group. And so we kind of extended the existing work from the 1940s that way. Now, our work was a long time ago and was very small samples. I'm always gratified when some undergraduate comes up and says, well, when I first learned econometrics, we used your data, because that makes me feel good, because I remember the system. And really a beautiful analysis, and basically confirms what we found in our analysis. So I think what I would say is that most of the evidence on minimum wages has actually pointed toward this original, or more toward Joan Robinson's view than toward the more traditional 1950s economics view. And it's not just in the United States that some of that evidence has been constructed. So in 1996, after basically never having had a real minimum wage, Britain introduced its first national minimum wage. And again, a lot of economists were somewhat skeptical. A lot of detailed analysis suggested that if we look at places that hadn't raised the minimum and places that didn't, it didn't really seem to have an effect. In 2016, Germany did the same thing. And I discussed this at one of our talks today. This was pretty surprising to a lot of people because German economists are pretty conservative. And in fact, Angela Merkel's head of her economic council was one of my former PhD students who was very strongly opposed to raising the minimum wage. basically thought that was a really dumb idea. But Mrs. Merkel thought that this would be good politically, and she also was a little skeptical of the economists, I think, and thought that maybe they were overstating their case. And so it turned out that they raised the minimum wage, imposed a minimum wage in Germany after never having had one for many years. And one advantage of Germany is they have amazingly good data on firms. So you can actually see region by region what happened. And interestingly, a rich region like Munich, there wasn't an effective minimum wage because everybody was already earning more than the new minimum. But in a poor region, like the parts of the former east part of Germany, closer to the Polish border, there were fairly large effects. And yet, there didn't seem to be deployment. So the broader picture seems to be that, in fact, a better way of thinking about the labor market might be to think about employers as having some market power. That size of that market power is still in debate, and people are working on that. A lot of PhD economists are working on that even as we speak. Thinking about, is there groups for whom this is really a big concern? Is this groups for whom the older, more traditional model actually applies? To return then to the scorecard, what I think we can say is that the employment effects of minimum wages, at least at the levels of minimum wages that we see in most countries, have not turned out to have been a big concern. We don't know very much about the investment side. I think there's going to be interesting studies of that in the German context, for example, where this really good data exists. A little bit in the US. There's definitely research suggesting that minimum wages increase consumer prices. And on the other hand, there is stronger and stronger evidence that minimum wages also do in fact raise the incomes of low-wage workers rather than force those low-wage workers to basically lose their jobs. So it's a nuanced picture. You could be concerned about the price effects of minimum wages. You could be concerned about the investment effects and still say, okay, even with all this new evidence, economists have found, I still think that increasing the minimum wage might be a bad idea, and I don't want to risk that right now. But I think we have made some progress in changing the view of economists about how the labor market works. And outside of the US, or outside of the federal government in the US at least, changing to some extent, leading to some changes in policy. So in the US, many states, a few cities have adopted fairly high minimum wages. At the federal level, I don't think anything's going to happen. Europe, I mentioned the increase in the minimum wage in Europe, in Germany. The rest of the world, there have been increases in minimum wage. Some people, I think that it's may have gone a little too far. So, for instance, Brazil has raised its minimum wage quite high. It's a country with a big informal sector, very heavily reliant on a few sectors like agriculture and so on that might rely on low-wage labor. So there's going to be, over the next decade, continuing reevaluation, and it's quite possible that views on this will change, but I think we have made progress in thinking about how the labor market works. So future directions in this area, there's going to be more work modeling the degree of imperfect competition between workers. A really interesting example of this is in the nurses' labor market. This is a school, Emory is a school that's well known for its nursing school. And one of the traditional places where people have always found evidence that employers exert market power over their workers is in the nursing market. And so I think we're going to see continuing research along those lines. We're going to see more research on this longer-term effects of minimum wages, like investment. Is it really the case that you can have an increase in wages and not deter investment? I think that's a pretty important question. And we're going to see more and more research on the poverty impacts and so on. So to conclude my talk then, let me say I think we now understand, as a result of a combination of new ideas about how to do the research, newly available data, and lots of young people in the field really working creatively, bringing lots of new ideas to the data, to the questions. We now understand much more about the effects of both immigration and minimum wages. There's a very large research center in London devoted to immigration, run by my friend Christian Guzman, that annually sponsors a conference with hundreds of people working on that topic. The state of the art in this area, in these areas, both areas, is about using these massive data sets that cover nearly all the workers in the economy Many economists, of course not all economists, economists are, just like everybody else, a certain fraction never change their views. But many economists, and many younger economists in particular, have updated their models a little bit to reflect some of the ideas that I think the research has suggested are more useful. And research has possibly influenced minimum wage policy. Even there, it's hard to say for sure that the research was the driver, or whether people just said, well, I got to do something about low wages and I don't want to spend any money, so I'm going to raise minimum wages. That's an alternative theory. Probably all that economic research has not influenced immigration policy very much in most countries. So many open questions to debate in both areas. My takeaway from this is economists can contribute to public policy with their research. But we have to be very modest about what we can do, and we have to understand that sometimes the reasons why people are, for instance, in the case of immigration, the reasons why people are talking about the issue and supporting one side or the other really are a little bit outside of the focus that a lot of the economic research is on. And so it suggests that there would be big benefit to economists reading what's going on in political science, maybe working together with political science sociologists, other people, saying, okay, why do you think that this is such a topical policy? And I think we're seeing more and more of that kind of work. So thank you very much, and I'll be glad to take it.
Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge gained through years of research and experience. We have collected some questions from members of the audience who RSVP'd, and we'll take a few minutes to let you answer some of those. The first comes from Ashish Bhatt, who is a friend of Emory, and Ashish says, software is an increasingly good substitute for an increasing number of types of labor. At what point will that trend make clear that increasing minimum wage will materially impact employers' hiring decisions?
Okay, thanks, Ashish. I think, interesting question. My understanding is that in most places where there's a lot of AI and robots and so on going into the workforce, wages are pretty high right now, and so the minimum wage is probably not a binding issue to the extent that there are workers left in the U.S. in manufacturing, which is, by the way, a steadily decreasing share of all workers are in manufacturing. They tend to be fairly highly skilled. There's very, very few low-wage manufacturing workers in the United States, almost none. So the traditional low-wage manufacturing industries like toys, some kinds of furniture, some kinds of low value steel products, those are all gone. They left the U.S. 25 years ago. So we are left with a manufacturing sector that is fairly highly skilled. And I don't think that the AI thing is going to necessarily affect low skilled workers in those sectors too much.
Thank you. Professor Masumi is a member of our economics faculty, and he says, as exemplified by your own pioneering work on causal inference, econometrics has been the leader in dealing with observational or non-experimental data. How do you see this leadership role evolve with high-dimensional big data and AI developments?
Thanks, that's another good question. So I was working at Amazon for the last couple of years as a consultant, and I saw firsthand a lot of work trying to answer causal questions with observational data using ML type methods. So I think people are working on that. It's definitely a frontier question. I think at this point, I would say it's something like the following. If you had a really good research design, like if you could do an RCT, randomized controlled trial, then at relatively low cost and decisively answer the question, now that's still going to be best answer. Or if you can come up with a really credible regression discontinuity, which is a case where you compare two groups that are very close to some cutoff, like an eligibility criteria for student loans or something like that. Those kind of analyses, I think, are very credible and also easy to understand whether they're going right or they're going wrong. One of the problems confronting the ML approach right now is it's hard to apply them and be able to understand what's the evidence that my analysis method is correct. So one of the advantages of the very simple kinds of methods that have kind of been used widely by labor economists is that we've developed over the years, and at first we didn't fully understand this, but we've developed over the years ways to say, okay, you say that you're going to evaluate this thing with a difference of differences, or with some kind of comparison. If what you say is true, then the following other things should also be true, and we can evaluate that, and we can get some confidence in what we're doing. And I think the ML approaches are not yet there, but they will, I think, move in that direction. And I would be shocked if eventually we don't make some progress there.
Thank you. Our next question comes from a student, Wendy Wong. She says, and it's actually a multi-part question, we're going to do it in parts here. What do you believe is the greatest contribution that today's economists can make to the world?
Well, thank you, Wendy. So I'm always remembered at a time like this, words of my father, who said, just stop talking. So I think economists can make a contribution to the world in helping to, first thing we can do is document facts. So believe it or not, there's huge arguments about facts, like what fraction of people in different education categories are immigrants versus natives? What fraction of people earn something like less than within $1 of current minimum wage? And a lot of times those facts, even though they're just facts, can help inform a debate. And so I think that's our first order thing. And in a lot of countries, poor countries, there's a dearth of such facts. And a lot of times people are proposing overly simplistic solutions. And you can kind of imagine if you're in a very difficult situation, it would be very nice if there was an easy way to do something. And a lot of times I think economists can kind of provide the bad news of saying, well, you could try that, but it isn't going to matter because the thing you're talking about is too small to matter. Or the group that you're thinking about isn't really that big a deal in the labor market. So that's our first thing. And the second thing I think is we can help in this causal inference idea. So we can help decide what kind of things work and what kind of things don't work. And oftentimes in the policy arena, somebody needs to make a decision, and there isn't really much, after that's done, analysis to find out, well, was that the right decision? And so what we kind of do is we're kind of like the cleanup crew that come in, there's like a big mess, and we sort through the mess and we say, okay, well, actually it looks like this was what was going on, not that. And to the extent we can do that in a sort of patient and impartial way, I think in the longer run we can have some effect. But I'm not overly optimistic that we can change the world.
And speaking about changing the world, in your opinion, what is the most effective financial tool that economists can use to leverage the issue of poverty?
Money. I'm a big believer in the value of just giving people money. I know that's a bit controversial, but I think that that's a very old-fashioned view about people, that if you give people money, they kind of know what to do best with it. And sometimes it's possible that that's not true. For instance, in the case of my sister. But, so I'm aware of examples where that's not true. But I think that we can contribute by saying, look, if you want to make these people better off and you're willing to spend this amount of money, then why don't you just give those people the money? If you're going to try and make people better off by not spending any money, why do you think that's going to work? And that's not a very popular position, but it is, I think, important that somebody does it. And so I think we can take the heat for that.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. This comes from another student, Bowen Yu. And Bowen asks, what are the characteristics of a top research paper? And could you elaborate on your answer by using one paper that you have produced that you are particularly proud of?
Well, I think everybody, people who are economists, if you run into scientists or any kind of people involved in research, you'll see that they will always say the most important thing is a curiosity to try and figure out what is going on that you don't understand, or what is it that you could do to try and fix some problem. So a combination of curiosity and potentially a little bit of goodwill or do-gooderism to sort of say something isn't quite there. In terms of projects, I think I would not point to my own work, but probably the thing that I'm most proud of, or one of the things I'm most proud of, I had a couple of graduate students who, in the course of their grad student training, helped me work on the Mariel Bullitt project and a couple of other projects like that, where it was a very simple comparison. And this was, one person's name was Robert Lalonde, one person's name was Dan Sullivan, and these two worked on the problem, what happens when someone loses a job? And believe it or not, until mid-1990s, there was not any agreement among economists on that. The standard economic model says you can work for this employer for this wage, but there's other employers out there that you can go to. So in the standard economic model, if your firm closes, you just go to another firm. Now we all know, at least if you've had anybody in your family who lost a job like through a firm closure, you know there's something wrong with that theory. And what they did was they applied exactly the same ideas. They had a comparison group, and what the comparison group was, they looked at firms that had a downsizing, so around a third of all the workers at the firm left, and they compared them to the people who stayed. And they showed very large wage losses, and that simple analysis has really influenced a huge amount of work subsequent to them, both methodologically, although that's a very simple idea, and also substantively, in getting people to think about, well, why is it that you lose a job and you can't easily reproduce it? And so I'm most proud of their work.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Professor Card, for your informative and inspiring comments today. And thank you, everyone, for attending. You're dismissed.